ask unanimous consent to lift the quorum call.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to voice concern about the current state of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1949, more than 60 years ago, the United States joined with 11 other nations to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in order to ensure the mutual security of the member nations. From the beginning, the United States has served as NATO's backbone and provided a major share of the cost in manpower and resources. We have consistently answered the call of our NATO allies when they needed us, even when there was no clear United States interest involved. For example, in 1993, the United States military answered the call to participate in the NATO air action to enforce a UN ban on all unauthorized military flights over Bosnia-Herzegovina. After the Dayton Peace Accords in 1995, the United States stationed over 10,000 personnel in support of peacekeeping missions in Bosnia. For the following 9 years, we continued to retain a large number of forces there. In 1999, the United States again stepped up and provided a major share of the military resources for operations in Kosovo. At that time, I argued that we were assuming too many commitments in areas of the world where our own interests were vague. When President Clinton announced that he intended to send 4,000 U.S. troops for peacekeeping in Kosovo, I said, if we think the United States has the responsibility to go into all these civil conflicts, we are going to dissipate our resources, and it is going to place a heavy burden on our taxpayers. Today, after years of involvement with NATO-led operations in the Balkans, our forces are still a major component of the NATO Kosovo force, and we are still contributing approximately 800 troops to that effort. In fact, of the 22 nations now in NATO contributing troops in Kosovo, the United States military makes up approximately 13% of the total force. As far as cost is concerned, the United States taxpayer is still footing a very large bill for our presence in Kosovo. In fiscal year 2010, the President asked for $252 million to pay for operations in Kosovo. In FY 2011, it was $312 million. Now, as part of the fiscal year 2012 Overseas Contingency Operations Transfer Fund, the President is asking for $254 million. With this example in mind, I am now deeply concerned that we appear to be in the same position again, this time with NATO in Libya. On March 31st, NATO assumed command and control of Operation Unified Protector and was thereafter responsible for enforcing the no-fly zone over Libya. With this transfer of authority and responsibility from the United States to NATO, there was also an implicit understanding that all NATO member states would be expected to dedicate the necessary resources to adequately enforce UN resolutions 1970 and 1973. However, almost immediately after taking command, NATO requested a 48-hour extension of support from American fighter aircraft. This request for continued support from American air assets seemed to be at odds with the President's statement that coalition forces would be able to keep up the pressure on Gaddafi's forces. And so, once again, our nation is called upon to provide the bulk of the resources and funding for another NATO mission that is not in the vital security interests of the United States. Indeed, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates stated on April 21st at a DoD press conference that while it is not a vital interest for us, our allies considered it is a vital interest. And just as they have helped us in Afghanistan, we thought it important, the President thought it was important, to help them in Libya. We are now on track to spend more than $800 million of U.S. taxpayer money this fiscal year on operations involving Libya. I ask with significant concern, how are these operations going to be paid for? Where is DoD planning to get the extra almost $1 billion to spend on this operation? What programs will need to be cut to fund this third operation in which we are now involved? Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Will the President be submitting a supplemental appropriations bill on Libya? Now, with the example of Libya in our minds, let us be clear as to exactly what our allies are contributing to the efforts in Afghanistan. As part of the International Security Assistance Force, which is the command in charge of operations in Afghanistan, the United States is contributing 70% of the total force, with 46 nations contributing the remaining 30%. And so, as we review the landscape of American military commitments overseas, let me emphasize, with U.S. forces deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, we should not also be participating in open-ended conflict in Libya, where we have no clear, vital national security interest. Moreover, I believe our NATO allies who do have a vital interest in Libya should be willing to play a lead role in terms of funding as well as military resources. The fact is, NATO and the Arab League should be shouldering the brunt of the military and financial burdens associated with Operation Unified Protector, just as we are doing in Afghanistan and have been doing in Iraq. If we had all members of NATO contributing proportionately to the mission in Libya and also had the Arab League providing comparable financial and military assistance, the overwhelming commitment of our own U.S. forces would be lessened to a manageable degree. Madam President, I am frustrated that our NATO allies continue to contribute such a small amount of resources for operations that are in the vital interest of many NATO member states. In Libya, I believe that if the United States military were to stop providing to our allies our unique military capabilities, NATO operations for both the no-fly zone as well as the civilian protection mission would be seriously degraded and could terminate. How have we arrived at this unfortunate state of affairs? Why is it that NATO nations are unable to effectively operate against a weak and isolated nation like Libya without significant military contributions from the United States? One reason we are in this position is because many NATO members are not contributing enough of their gross domestic product to defense. Instead, many NATO members simply look to the United States and the American taxpayer to pay for any gaps in defense capabilities. And because many NATO nations do not invest strategically in their military capabilities, they are heavily dependent on the United States to pay for advanced equipment such as intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance platforms to support their NATO operations. I agree with Secretary Gates' recent assessment that NATO is turning into a two-tiered alliance in which very few members, except for the United States, take on the hard power combat assignments. Instead, the majority of NATO partners limit themselves to soft power work, such as delivering humanitarian aid. Indeed, of the 28 NATO members, only 5, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Greece, and Albania, exceed the agreed-upon ratio of 2% of gross domestic product to be spent on defense. 2 decades after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. share of NATO defense spending has now risen astoundingly to more than 75%. Secretary Gates put all of our efforts under NATO alliance operations together, 75%. We are all aware that the United States is facing very hard and real, serious fiscal constraints. Hence, it is clear that we can no longer continue to pay for the vast majority of NATO operations that are not in the vital security interests of our nation. It is time for the United States to ask our allies to step up and keep the agreement they made when they became part of NATO, or for the United States to consider reducing our spending level that we now provide to NATO, and also move to redeploy a large portion of our military presence in Europe back to the United States. I have spoken on the floor many times about my concerns for maintaining such a large military presence in Europe, and I will continue to fight for spending cuts to a largely unnecessary and expensive United States military presence on the European continent. It was decided in the last administration to cut back to 2 brigade combat teams in Europe, in Germany. We have now had the 2 be expanded to 4. The other 2 are now in limbo. So there are now 4 brigade combat teams in Europe, and 2 were supposed to move back to the United States, and the military construction to house at least one of those has been done at a cost of over $400 million taxpayer dollars. So we have the capability to bring home troops. Taxpayers have spent $400 million in pursuit of that. The barracks sit empty, and we still have 4 brigade combat teams in Europe, in Germany. Unfortunately, here is the message that we are sending to our European allies by that military presence and by our operations in support of NATO, that American taxpayers are willing and able to shoulder the burden for their defense, and that there are apparently no consequences if the Europeans fail to do their fair share. Madam President, we need to change that message. We need to give our nation's current financial difficulties a priority. Our message should be that NATO has been a valuable alliance for 60 years, and it can be in the future with an effort to share the burden. That means truly sharing. The U.S. to lead when our capabilities are essential. We do have vast capabilities. When they are essential, we have shown we will always be there. But others can lead where they have the capability to do so, and they need to do it with personnel and with the pay-fors. It is increasingly a threat to our security that the complacency of our allies are so great that we are shouldering more and more of the burden, even if it is not in the direct interest of the United States. The American taxpayer can no longer afford to write endless checks for NATO operations. It is time for our allies to shoulder their responsibilities and reduce their dependence on United States military forces. Madam President, we want to keep our military strength. We have the greatest military in the world. There is no doubt about that. But to keep our military strong, we cannot over-deploy our forces. We have had, and I have talked to people who have been to Afghanistan 6 times, on rotations 6 times. Most of our people who have gone to Afghanistan have gone more than once, and that is following all of the times they have been into Iraq as well. We must keep our military strong by not overburdening them because our allies are not supplying the troops that they agreed to provide when they became members of NATO. For us to keep the strength that we have, for the big operations where we have the unique capabilities, we must be smart about allocating and sharing the responsibilities. We can take the biggest share, but not 75% of the share, and remain strong, especially with the financial constraints that we have today. We are in the midst of negotiating how we can lower our deficits so that we don't hit that $14 trillion debt ceiling without a plan for bringing down the deficit so we will never have to lift that debt ceiling again. So it is in everyone's interest for our allies to step up to the plate. They made agreements. It used to be a 3% gross domestic product commitment that was required for NATO. Now we're talking 2% and only 5 countries. Only 5 countries meet that test. That is not a sustainable alliance. If we drag down our strongest member, it will not be in the interest of anyone if something big happens that needs an immediate and robust response. So I appreciate that Secretary Gates, in his final 3 weeks, 1 month in office, has talked very straight to our NATO allies. And I hope that they are listening, and I hope they are prepared to act. Yes, they have financial constraints too. We understand that. But it is time that the sharing be shared. It is time that we have a real alliance in which we remain strong so that we have the strength to respond in the big emergencies where we are called. But being dragged down by smaller emergencies that can be handled by others, whether it is Kosovo or even Iraq or certainly Libya, and certainly people are concerned about the situation in Syria and Yemen, we can let others handle and be in the lead in those areas so that when the big things such as Afghanistan will continue to be, can be handled by the United States with our unique capabilities and our commitment. Our fighters are the best in the world. Our equipment is the best in the world. Our training is the best in the world. We need to maintain that strength with an alliance that has a burden sharing where we are the lead, but we are not in such a lead that we are dragging down the capabilities for the future. So, Madam President, I applaud Secretary Gates for starting this dialogue in earnest. We've talked about it for a long time, for years actually. We have talked to our NATO allies about stepping up to the plate. Even in the good financial times, that didn't happen, but for a few. And I will say that Great Britain has always been there, and we have had other strong alliances. Australia, not in NATO, but certainly a strong ally. Canada, strong ally. But it is time for us to reassess our contributions in NATO to preserve our strength so that we are there for the big ones, which is in all of our interests. Thank you, Madam President, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that the period for morning
Senate is in
business...
a quorum call, Senator.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
And without objection, it is.
I ask unanimous consent that the period for morning business be extended until 6 p.m., with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you. I ask I yield the floor. No, to suggest the absence of a quorum. Thank you.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
for call and progress be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm going to wait until the senator from Illinois arrives before making a motion, but I'd like to explain what I'm going to make a motion on when he does arrive. I have an amendment. First of all, being the ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, I have more than just a passive interest in this EDA bill. But one of the things I've been trying to do is get people to understand that we have all these amendments, and a lot of these amendments have nothing to do with the Economic Development Administration. They have to do with everything else that's out there, and in fact, I'm guilty of the same thing. I have, I think, 5 unrelated amendments. They're all good stuff, things I'd like to get through, and that seems to be what this bill is all about. But underlying all these amendments, there is a bill, and there's a reason for introducing it. And it's a foregone conclusion, I think we all understand, that if we were to pass the EDA bill out of here in any form similar to the way it was introduced, it would never pass the House. And that would be a done deal. What I'm going to attempt to do is I'm going to attempt today and tomorrow, however long it takes, to get an amendment in there that is going to provide oversight authority by the GAO. Through the audits and assessments, the GAO can ensure that the EDA grants are distributed and put some discipline, spending discipline in there, like through a competitive award process. It's all drafted in the amendment. By the way, the amendment is number 459. And in accordance with the EDA criteria and requirements. Additionally, the GAO would submit a report every year to the Senate Environment Public Works Committee and the House T&I, Transportation and Infrastructure Committees, to have efficiency assured. Now, what we're doing here is, instead of just having a jump ball and saying we're going to do any kind of an EDA program that we can sell through the administration, actually have discipline in there so that it'll have to be, first of all, gone over with the General Accounting Office, and then after that it's not over because it has to come back to both committees in the House and the Senate. And of course I'm the ranking member, and by the time this started I may end up being the chairman if it's after the next election, but you never know those things. So we'd be able to look at it again. Now, the purpose of the amendment is to make certain that grant recipients are determined based on competitive procedures and to create a more accountability for the EDA. And overall, I think the Washington bureaucrats should not be picking winners and losers, but instead rely on a formula and strict rules to determine where agency dollars flow. Now, I know we're not on the bill now. We're still in morning business. I understand we're going to go back on the bill at 6 o'clock this afternoon, but I have to get a request in that my amendment be in at that time. I'm going to ask that the pending amendment be set aside for consideration of amendment number 459, which I have just described. And for right now, okay, good. And I think the chief complaint about some of the EDA process, and by the way, I have to say about the EDA process, it has done so well in my state of Oklahoma. We had one project in Elgin, Oklahoma, a very small community adjacent to the live range at Fort Sill, that for a $2.25 million EDA grant, they ended up planning to construct a 150,000 square foot building that would employ the numbers were almost the entire population of Elgin, Oklahoma. It's something that would really revive that part of the state. The southern part of the state of Oklahoma, the south central part, has historically been an area that's somewhat impoverished, and through these EDA grants we have really done a good job. The good thing about EDA grants is that they require a lot of local participation. Generally, it's through the city funds and state funds and county funds, and then an equal amount or a greater amount from the private sector. In my state of Oklahoma, the grants are usually about 1 to 9 in terms of public participation. So the program is good. I'm the first one to admit, however, it may not work that way, the same way in every state. I can only say what our experience has been in Oklahoma. Now, what I'm going to suggest with this amendment is something that we are doing anyway in Oklahoma. We are going through a competitive award process. That's a process that everyone understands. It is one that is all outlined in our rules. We know what they have to go through for competition. and then it's in accordance with the criteria. The criteria is very important. One of these days, we're going to get around to a transportation reauthorization bill that will come out of my same committee. It's the last one we had was 2005, and since then, we've just been, that has run out, and we're going just kind of month to month. We have a dire need for infrastructure in America, in the roads, highways, bridges. It's something that we've fallen behind on, and we're going to be getting to that. Well, the reason that our 2005 bill was so successful in infrastructure for transportation in the reauthorization bill is because we had a formula, and the formula took into consideration money to be spent on bridges and roads and highways that state by state. It would such factors as the fatalities in that state, the number of road lanes, miles, and all this criteria. And when we got through establishing the criteria in 2005, it must have been good because nobody liked it. If it was something that upset everyone, then obviously it's one that was really pretty good. And we passed it. That was a $284.6 billion bill, reauthorization bill. We should be able to do something comparable now. Now, you might say everyone's goosey about spending money nowadays, and that's understandable with the deficits. This administration is actually, in President Obama's 3 budgets, has suggested and has put into effect $5 trillion of deficit, not debt, but deficit. And this last budget was around a little over $2.5 trillion. And I can remember, Mr. President, back in 1995, back when President Clinton was in office, going down to the floor and complaining because he had a budget to run the entire country of $1.5 trillion. Well, the deficit alone in the last budget we've had here, as prescribed by the President, has exceeded the amount it took to run the country during that period of time. I see that the senator from Illinois is here, and let me just tell you, I say to my good friend from Illinois, what I'm doing here is I'm going to attempt now, and it'll be objected to, and I understand that because we're not to the bill yet, but I'm going to continue to attempt to have an accountability amendment that takes the EDA process and subjects it to competitive award process along with oversight by the GAO and by our committee and by the T&I committee in the House of Representatives. I think it's something that would make, frankly, if we don't do it, in my opinion, there would be no way in the world that the House of Representatives would pass it. This offers discipline to it, and I'll go so far to say that if we're not able to pass this amendment, to have accountability, I will probably end up voting against the bill if it comes up for a vote. So with that in mind, I would ask unanimous consent that it be in order to resume consideration of S. 782 so that I can call up my amendment number 459, which is at the desk.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. What I'm about to say is no reflection on the senator from Oklahoma nor the merits of his amendment. We have almost 100 amendments filed and 17 pending, and the majority leader has asked that we at least reflect on those filed and set our schedule accordingly. I'm not saying that this won't be considered, but at the moment we are going to object to the offering of additional amendments, so I do object.
Objection is heard.
Suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
you.